Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to our latest Climate Reality Book Club event, a conversation with Dr. Jessica Hernandez about her book, Growing Papaya Trees, Nurturing Indigenous Roots During Climate Displacement. The Climate Reality Book Club is for both members of the Climate Reality Network and the general public as well to discuss books with a wide range of themes and genres that are related to climate. We regularly host webinars with the authors of our selected books, which are moderated by Climate Reality staff and other experts from the field. These webinars provide a unique opportunity to engage in Q&A and commentary and learn more about what you can do to take action on climate. They're open to all, so feel free to invite your friends and family to join them. If you are a Climate Reality leader or a US chapter member, you can join our book club group on Reality Hub. We use that group to announce each of our book selections and information about upcoming webinars. You can tune into that group to suggest future book selections, stay up to date with events, and see what other folks have been reading. If you don't yet have a Reality Hub account, you can contact support@climatereality.com and we will assist you. Beginning last year, we've partnered with our friends at the Canada branch of Climate Reality, who host small group discussions on eco-literature, and most recently, they have been discussing growing papaya trees. We're so excited to have Ashley from Climate Reality Canada moderating the conversation today. If you or a friend would like to join those discussions, Ashley's going to put that info in the chat. Just a final note that today's webinar is being recorded, and throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit questions for our speakers using that Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ashley.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. My name is Ashley Anthony. I am the Communication and Education Special Projects Manager at Climate Reality Project Canada. Before we begin our wonderful evening or afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from, I want to respectfully recognize and acknowledge the enduring relationships that Indigenous people across the Americas have with this beautiful land and these incredible waters that we all live on and benefit from. From the Arctic to the Amazon, Indigenous nations have stewarded these territories since time immemorial, sustaining deep cultural, spiritual, and ecological connections that continue to this day. The Climate Reality Project operates within this border context of Indigenous homelands across Turtle Islands and beyond. And so we honor and respect the many nations whose lands have long been places of gathering, exchange, and governance, and whose stewardship continues despite ongoing histories of colonization and displacement. I personally am joining from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, as well as the homelands of the Wolastoqiyik, the Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and Abenaki nations, or the Wabanaki Confederacy, alongside the Innu and Inuit peoples. These lands or these nations have maintained deep, deep relationships to these beautiful lands and waters for thousands of years and continue to do so today. And I, living in what we present day colonially call St. John, New Brunswick, continue to enjoy and prosper from these lands. Across the Americas, Indigenous communities are diverse and distinct, each with their own governance systems, languages, and relationships to this beautiful land. While these relationships are place specific, they also are connected through a shared values of reciprocity, responsibility, and respect for the natural world. So we encourage everyone joining from the different regions to take the time to learn about the Indigenous nations whose lands that you are on, and reflect on the ongoing responsibilities that come with living, working, and gathering there. This includes thinking beyond acknowledgement towards meaningful action and relationship building. We are all joining from Indigenous lands, so I invite you to reflect on this prompt from Naomi Sayers. If you are a non-Indigenous person and think that land acknowledgements aren't enough, or you want to do something more or better, start describing your relationship to the land. Where did your family come from? How did you end up here today? And what have you benefited from? What have you benefited from, lost, or gained? With that, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Jessica Hernandez, a globally recognized Indigenous scientist, climate justice leader, and of course, best-selling author whose groundbreaking work has redefined environmentalism through an Indigenous lens. Rooted in the beautiful Pacific Northwest, she bridges Indigenous science, traditional ecological knowledge, and Western frameworks to confront the most urgent environmental crisis of our time. She currently serves as the Director for Indigenous Science and Research at Earth Daughters, a leading global research initiative that centers Indigenous knowledge systems to inform advocacy, guide policy, and advance climate justice and ecological sustainability. Dr. Hernandez is also, of course, the acclaimed author of one of my favorite books, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science, that came out in 2022. It's a best-selling, award-winning book that shapes global policy, academia, and activism. Her second book, which we'll be discussing tonight and is in her background, Growing Papaya Trees, Nurturing Indigenous Roots During Climate Displacement, examines climate migration, colonialism, and Indigenous resilience in the face of forced displacement. Of course, she is brilliant within her own rights. She holds a PhD in environmental and forest sciences, a Master of Marine Affairs, and a Master of Science in environmental and forest sciences from the University of Washington. In recognition of her visionary leadership, Forbes named her one of the 100 most powerful and influential women in Central America. Her thought leadership continues to shape global conversations on decolonizing environmentalism and Indigenous science. And her work has been featured in NPR, Vox, Teen Vogue, Latino USA, Science Friday, the UN News, among others. So again, it's our distinct pleasure to have you here, Dr. Hernandez. I hope that you're having a wonderful day today.
Thank you so much. So Wendell Padici, as mentioned, my name is Jessica Hernandez, and I'm calling from the beautiful lands of the Coast Salish peoples, also known as Seattle, named after Chief Seattle. And thank you so much for having me here today.
Like I said, our deep, deep pleasure. I figure we'll start off with a great way to begin the conversation of your wonderful book. If you are joining from our book club, of course, you have joined us for the last 4 months as we've read this book. And I have to say that we've had incredible feedback from it. And the first question that I have for you is, when you wrote this book, who did you envision as the primary audience for this book? How did you hope different audiences would receive it?
Yeah, thank you so much for your first question. So when I was writing this book, I was writing from a solutions-based approach. My first book kind of laid the foundation of what it meant to be an Indigenous scientist, and also coming from surviving a genocide, at least my father. And the second book was to kind of critique some of the climate solutions that we have in a way advanced in our society, and one of them being renewable energy, and also to highlight that climate displacement and climate refugees are increasing in numbers. So I wanted the audience to be community members, anybody who cares about our earth and who cares about looking at climate change from an intersectional lens.
Beautiful. This, compared to your first novel, was very literarily different. Your first novel felt autobiographical. It really felt like a retelling of your own personal story and your own personal setting. This book has 6 very succinct chapters that feel more as if it's a guide. What was the shift in impact that you were looking for when writing this, and how has this actually continued your personal journey?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because I think when I first wrote my first book, it was a couple of years ago, and I think that is also showing my trajectory as a climate scientist. I actually have a trilogy in this series. So the first book kind of focused more on the past, reliving what my father experienced, the trauma of the Civil War or Central American genocide that took place against Indigenous Maya folks. And this book kind of focuses on the present reality, like where we are facing as Indigenous peoples when we talk about climate change and displacement. And the third book is going to focus on the future. So I wanted to, in a way, weave how, as Indigenous peoples, at least in my families and communities, we tell stories, right? We talk about the past, then we mention the present, but we move and weave in the future so that we don't lose hope and that we continue to exist in, as you know, the future takes place and things go on as we progress in our lifetimes.
That's beautiful. Story is an important piece of the climate the the climate solution that I think many people overlook. Um, as we move forward into the future, we also want to, and this is defined in your book as well, like we also want to ensure that we are moving forward in an equitable way without these prescribed solutions or technocratic silver bullets, hand in hand, joined in community. And you talk about two-eyed seeing. How would you define and apply two-eyed seeing in the context of climate justice and Indigenous knowledge systems and climate solutions?
Yeah, every time I think about just growing up as an Indigenous woman and then entering the Western sciences, which allowed me to become a climate scientist, study climate science in a more in-depth way, one of the things that I often look at is like balancing the responsibilities. And that is in a way implementing 2I Seen, where we as Indigenous scientists, we are upholding to the responsibilities that we have with our Mother Earth. We are upholding the relationships that we have with our animal plant relatives as well. And oftentimes, I often say that implementing 2I Seen allows us to look at the entire puzzle completed versus if we're just focusing on Western science, we're only looking at one or two puzzle pieces. So we're missing out the overall picture. I often say that because, like, for instance, renewable energy, right? We're looking at just like how do we move away from depending or our heavy dependence on fossil fuels so that we can reduce greenhouse emissions. But then we're not looking at how we are extracting renewable energy from many lands and desecrating indigenous lands across the globe. So in a way, 2I Seen brings back that relationality and also the emotional intelligence that we're often told to remove from the science that we're practicing. And I often like to call it relationality, but an elder told me that's emotional intelligence recently. So I like to use that word, right? As a scientist, we're told to leave our emotions, our feelings at the door when we're doing the science that we're doing as scientists in this society.
And it's very reductionist. You have to have a sterile view of looking at things, and you lose that holistic kind of perspective and objective as well. Something that you talked about in the book that honestly, like I wrestled with as I was reading it was a lot about like the imposed climate solutions and ironically, renewable energy. And so you critique greenwashing and green colonialism. What are those common forms that you see today, and how can communities identify and resist them and understand more equitable climate solutions?
Yeah, thank you for raising that question because oftentimes, right, we are told to look at corporations or businesses through the lens that they're trying to portray, right? Oftentimes, I think of like going to United Nations spaces and forums where climate change is being discussed, yet one of the biggest lobbyists is the fossil fuel industry. I often look at carbon markets and how carbon credits are allowing corporations or companies that are emitting greenhouse gases to kind of get a pass because they're buying these carbon credits to, in a way, make it seem like they're not necessarily emitting as much greenhouse gases. And I often say that greenwashing is sometimes hard for the common person to identify. And I think that that's why it's important, right, for organizations like Climate Reality and us as climate scientists to make sure that that information and that science is accessible to community members because we often see corporations or companies trying to greenwash, right? I live in Seattle and Amazon is one of the biggest companies or businesses that we have here. And, you know, they emit a lot of greenhouse gases and there's a lot of waste that is produced, yet sometimes packages have like a recycle stamp. And I feel like that in a way is also greenwashing. And I think that it's important for us to look at anything that is deemed as a climate solution or climate friendly through an intersectional lens because oftentimes it allows us to uncover the realities that are being hidden to the common folk or layperson in our societies.
And to just respond to that, like we talked about prescriptive solutions as well. And in your book, you detail how some of these things that I would say the average climate activist would deem as what we want to move towards can have upsetting effects and detrimental effects that are maybe not as widely known. Can you talk a little more for people that have not unfortunately finished your book yet?
Yeah, so for instance, if we talk about renewable energy, right? I often just bring up what's happening with the Paiute tribe in Nevada, where there is lithium mining that is taking place. And we know that lithium is one of the minerals or rare minerals that is used for renewable energy. Yet we are in a way made to feel good, right? If we're driving an electric car. And I'm not saying that, we should be anti-renewable energy. I think it's to look at it from a more holistic lens. And as a result of that, we also look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? Oftentimes it's children who are dying trying to mine cobalt. And I think that these social political landscapes that we sometimes ignore trying to create climate solutions can be detrimental for us. And I think it's questioning where everything comes from, even when it's sold as something that is climate friendly, environmental friendly. And oftentimes we can look at how we can create justice without, in a way, creating justice for a certain demographic while creating injustices in other regions. And I say that those are two concrete examples that I explore in the book, where we're looking at renewable energy as a solution. And obviously we need to stop our dependence on fossil fuels, but in the way that we desecrate our lands to create renewable energy means that it's also at the brunt is with Indigenous communities, especially from the global south. And as somebody who comes from the global south, I often see how renewable energy can destroy our lands, right? Because one of the other examples that I bring back to my homelands in Oaxaca is the wind farm that was created without our consent. And one of the things that we're seeing with Earth Daughters, working with the Ikutsk community and also working with my own communities, the Zapotec communities that rely on fisheries, we are seeing that fish are not growing tumors. So we're trying to deploy scientists so that they can explore where are these tumors from. And it doesn't necessarily need any experimentation, because what we're seeing for Indigenous peoples, right, who have that long-term observation, is that once this wind farm was created in the community, in the coastal communities and regions, the fish started to grow tumors. So we can see how, in a way, that is a solution, because yes, wind power is renewable, but for our subsistence and for our people who fish and depend on these fish, now we're consuming things that might be, not necessarily healthy and harmful to our overall well-being and health.
Yeah, the solution for all can't come at the expense of others, right? Or our environment to further that. And so we kind of talk about how to make these equitable decisions. What would it really look like to sit down and make decisions together in a way that reflects Indigenous government or governance and relational accountability?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I often say the first thing that we have to do is listen, right? Like, I think that oftentimes as scientists, we're taught that we have the solution, we have the question that we want to approach during our experiments. And oftentimes what it takes is for us to listen. And I say that as somebody who is working with other Indigenous communities that are not necessarily her own, where I have to build those relationships. And the first step is to listen, right? Because what my work in my community might not necessarily work for that community. And listening to hear and not listening to respond is something that is it's sometimes hard to unlearn, especially when you go through academia, when you go into corporations, the nonprofit sector, where listening is an art that is often not necessarily something that people have been taught, right? Because we're not taught how to listen. There's no listening 101 courses in the university system, but that is such a a simple thing that we can all do today even.
Always underrated as a way to approach relationships as well, right? A quote that kept surfacing in our discussions was, "There really is no answer, but what each of us can do in our own individual capacities." And so, how do you reconcile like individual action versus the need for deep systemic change?
Yeah, I often say that it takes us to decolonize our own mindsets, right? And to decolonize our own mindsets, we have to unlearn and relearn many of the ways that we have been taught. Like, for instance, how we approach science, how it's very binary and reductionist and reductionary in the sense that we are going from point A through point Z when we draw the conclusions. Versus for indigenous ways of knowing, it's more holistic, right? We have to sit down and connect the dots, not necessarily just focus on the fish, but also focus on the waters, focus on the forest. And I think that that's something that we should implement moving forward.
That's beautiful. And, you know, there's a colonial tendency, we've been talking about it, to segment and compartmentalize issues, especially those that contrast with like the indigenous, holistic, and intersectional approaches. So what shifts do we need to move between these two worlds and have that more holistic point of view? Like we talked about listening. Is there any other things that we should be paying attention to?
I often think of the teachings that my father taught me, right? And my father, he experienced a genocide at the age of 12. He was able to survive it and escape that reality at the age of 16. And despite facing the worst atrocities, right, that a child can face, he taught me three important teachings, and that was love, compassion, and empathy. And when I entered the sciences, I realized that a lot of our foundational history in the sciences lacks those three emotions, right? Love, empathy, and compassion. And as a result, I'm seeing how even research, right? The Guardian recently published a research study that demonstrated that globally, 60% of humans have lost their connection with nature. We're also seeing how mental health is declining across the United States and across the globe. And oftentimes, when we look at some of the holistic ways of healing, right? Not just healing ourselves, but also healing our environments, we have to reconnect to nature. And I often tell even my students, right, when they're stressed or they're facing something very emotionally heavy, to go hug a tree. And I know that sometimes it's hard in urban settings because we live in concrete jungles, but I think it's also reconnecting with nature and also integrating our environment so that we can reclaim that relationality that we have with our environments and lands. And I look at, mentors and role models like Dr. Robin Walkhammer, who is now leading the plant bathing plant movement so that people can start reconnecting with nature and planting, right? Because that's something simple that doesn't necessarily require a lot of resources for us to plant or keep plants or plant something outside of our vicinity. So I think that, reconnecting with nature and our environments will be the second thing that we can do as humans so that we can start to look at our environments through that relationality that indigenous peoples hold, and to also look at the ways that we do our work and the practices that we hold and do on our daily basis.
As you talk about this, it invokes this, I believe it was in your first book, the permaculture appropriation, right? And the idea that like permaculture was something that was invented and not like practice that indigenous people have been like utilizing and stewarding the land with for time immemorial since we've ever even started tracking. And so I find this interesting, especially as I go through my own decolonization practices and, like, as you say, like hugging trees, touching grass, like being in the real world. Right. But how, like, what are those meaningful and respectful ways for climate advocates and policy makers to incorporate Indigenous knowledge without appropriating or diluting it? Because I think that happens more often than not, unfortunately.
Yes, it happens more often because I think in our Western societies, right, we have been taught that any knowledge can be extracted. Like, for instance, when we want to study more about our forests, we can get a textbook and we can extract that knowledge from a textbook or a course. And I think it's also, unlearning that knowledges are to be extracted, to be consumed. And consumerism, right? Oftentimes we think about consumerism as material goods, but is oftentimes it can be knowledges, it can be voices, it can be other things like that. So I think it's being intentional, being open to making mistakes. I know that oftentimes mistakes are like something that we try to avoid, and I'm seeing that especially with the younger generation because social media has made it harder for them to cope with making mistakes because there's a lot of attacks, right? Sometimes on social media, like, oh, you make a mistake, then the youth get on that post. But I think that is being open to making mistakes, but being willing to learn from those mistakes and also create solutions and address those mistakes. And I think that we are in a society where we have diluted everything because of the integration of technology, where even our lives are curated in social media. It doesn't necessarily depict our everyday things. And even sustainability has become a trend on social media. So oftentimes I say that it's important to question our intentions, to not necessarily say, oh, we're just gonna use this reusable bag so that we can post something on social media to get more likes or followers. But I think it's something that we, as we're growing, right, especially in the era of social media, because I'm not saying we shouldn't use social media, because that's kind of hard, is to think about the intentions that we have. And going back to your question, is like thinking about the intentions that we have in incorporating Indigenous knowledges. Like, is it to advance our careers? And maybe we should step back and kind of rethink why we want to integrate Indigenous communities. Because in this case, permaculture, I will say that based on the analysis, right, the intentions were to create a new field of study and get this praise for being the founder of permaculture at the dispense of Aborigines in Australia, who taught the now founder of permaculture their way of life and incorporated him into their lifestyles and environments. And I think that is thinking about our intentions in doing that, so that we can come in a way that is respectful and also open to making mistakes, but also ratifying those mistakes with better solutions.
Would you say that this is also how one would move away from performative allyship towards like that deeper care, that presence, and that responsibility within climate work?
Yeah, that's very insightful, Ashley. Like, I feel like you know what to do. But yeah, that is true, right? Because I think that oftentimes when there's performative allyship, we just try to do it to check boxes, right? Because I think when we are looking at the demographics of the United States, we're seeing how many organizations have removed diversity, equity, and inclusion from their mission statements, from their work. And oftentimes, right, many people are say it because they were being performative. And I think that when you have good intentions, you don't do it just because it's a trend or because it's going to help you in any shape, way, or form, but because you actually truly believe in those statements, in those frameworks that you're trying to implement. So yes, I would say that, if you question your intentions and your intentions are good, then, that allows you to become an accomplice, right? Because oftentimes we need accomplices, not just allies who will say, yeah, I support Indigenous peoples, but when it comes to advocating for our rights, they're just sitting back and being like, let them take care
Watching
of it.
from afar, right?
Yeah.
We need accomplices in the thick with us, like what's happening at the Fairy Creek blockade and things like that, right? What happens in this Wasuitan land, people to stand side by side with Indigenous people that are fighting for their rights. Now, when we have conversations, people tend, especially, I'm not going to say all people because we can't make broad brushstrokes like that, but we generally tend to speak from an I versus the we perspective. So, what approaches or topics help bridge that divide?
I say that individualistic or individualism is something that we have learned, especially in present day, and something that we have to unlearn. And I often look at movements and talking to elders, both in the Black or Indigenous communities, that often said that the reason why they were able to abandon certain things or deconstruct certain systems of oppression was because there was a we, right? They care more about numbers. And I recently talked to Dr. Baranda Montgomery, who's an amazing author too, and her book is When Trees Testify. And she was talking about how when we move away from the I and we move into the we bring in voices and perspectives that are often excluded in conversations. And I often look at even joy, right? And joy, how joy has been a method of resistance, and joy has been something that we have celebrated as a community, right? It's hard to say, oh, I'm practicing joy by myself, right? Because that's in that it's kind of hard to accomplish that. But it's bringing in that collective measure and also that collective mindset that we are a community. And I often think of my grandmother, right, who often told me we're stronger in numbers. So going back to what Dr. Veranda Montgomery told me is that she doesn't want to continue to receive praises as being the first, right? Like the first Black botanist to receive a PhD in this university, the first in that. And those words stayed with me because oftentimes, yeah, many of us who are breaking barriers are the first to break those barriers. But for us to move into that collective mindset, we should think about not being the last, right? And oftentimes we fixate so much on the accolades and rewards that come from being the first that we forget that there are people following us as well, and we should leave that door open. So having that conversation with her made me think of this question, especially today.
You know, I'm the person at work who, like, my background is environmental education and communication. So I'm always preaching this kinship worldview, and everybody's looking at me like, what is she talking about? And I really do believe that storytelling and relational thinking is an important and integral part, like we said before, of climate solutions. And um, I want to say breeding a worldview that helps us evolve past where we are right now. What role do you feel that storytelling and relational thinking play when shifting people towards that more collective, responsibility centered worldview?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for doing that work, right? Because I think we need more people to push us to think of storytelling as a method also to help us unlearn and relearn and decolonize our ways of mind. And I often say that reading has been a gift and also a curse, right? Because oftentimes you have to read a lot when you are in school. I recall all the books that I feel like we were forced to read in high school. But oftentimes when I look back and as I grown older, right, these books allow me to expand my own critical thinking skills and to look at the world not just from my lens, but incorporate other lenses, right? And I often have to talk about how Black feminist books or books from the Black movements have allowed me to look at life from a different perspective, right? Because as an Indigenous woman from the global South, my perspective is limited to my own lived experiences and my own realities. And I say that storytelling allows us to expand that reality because oftentimes we only focus on what's important for us and how to advance our careers or improve our lives in the present day as an individual. But we forget that we should incorporate that communal lens, right? Like, how do we advance our societies to help our communities as opposed to just one individual? And I often think of the teaching that I was taught, right? That is, it takes 3 generations for us to see change. And I think that it's hard sometimes to understand that, right? Because you're like, oh, I want change to happen overnight, especially when you're younger. But as I grown and entering, right, my life now, I see that because change happens in 3 generations, I cannot just look at myself or apply that individualistic lens, but actually look at the communal lens and look at the 3 generations that are yet to come so that we can actually see the changes that we, like you and I are actively working to dismantle today.
That's actually so beautiful and so hopeful. It seeds so much hope in that idea that it doesn't have to lie or rest with you, that there is more coming in the future. The juxtaposition of that is what the current present is looking like right now. Like, obviously, things feel like we're in a bit of a bizarro world, for lack of a better term. We have this increasing, well, first off, climate denial that's happening. We have the increasing climate displacement that goes hand in hand with that, as well as continued industrial monopolization and expansion. So not even just moving into territories that they've never moved before, but also eating up all of the competition so that there is nothing that even can combat the way of being. And then we have these emerging technologies like AI that pose a serious threat to our ability to prosper in the future and generations to prosper in the future and biodiversity to prosper in the future. So what changes do you foresee for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous communities alike coming in the future, and how How do you wrestle with that when you think of future generations and the three generations and where we are at right now?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up because I think AI is a really complex topic. And oftentimes, right, what we are seeing now is that folks are using AI like it's a search engine where people are like typing in a question. But oftentimes, and this goes back to some of the discussions we were having, right, in the conversation earlier, how we forget the direct impact or the immediate impact that using AI is generating for our environments, right? We're seeing how communities that are near AI centers are seeing a lot of pollution in their waters. And oftentimes it's something that has makes life convenient for a certain demographic, but then it makes it inconvenient for the demographic that is facing the brunt of these impacts. And oftentimes we have to integrate new technologies into our societies, and because obviously it's kind of hard, right, to escape AI, or the discussions of AI today, but I think it has to be done in a respectful way where it's not using data as a form of extraction to then later create more damages. And I think that the discussions, even with many of the AI companies, right, is they're pushing them because a lot of the data is not private, it's not safeguarded, and it's just data that is being made accessible to governments or leaders or politicians. And I think that there has to be more mechanisms that protect that data, right? Because data is also power, and data also allows us to move forward, especially as we are trying to achieve climate justice and environmental justice.
My apologies. My sound wasn't working there. Okay.
No
We got a
worries.
whole bunch of people saying, "Hey, I can't hear you. You can hear me now?" Good. So as we're talking about AI, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues focusing on AI and health is this year. Is there like what are the most urgent risks and opportunities that you could see from this type of intersection?
I think that it's moving the agenda to look at things from a more holistic lens, and I think it's like applying the two I seen like kind of lens and framework that you mentioned earlier, right? Where we're not just focusing on AI as its own entity, but we're also looking at the intersectionalities and the impacts that it has in our health. And oftentimes, right, even when we look at communities that live closer to these pollutant like highest emitters, whether it be industries, we often see how health in those communities is the worst, right? Where, for instance, when you look at Los Angeles, right, where I grew up, communities of color tend to have more asthma rates because we tend to live near airports, or we live in near industries that are emitting a lot of smog smoke, I mean, or smog. I'm trying to, but as a result of that, right, we are seeing how we're talking about AI and the intersections that it has to our health, right? We're seeing how communities are already facing health disparities because they live near AI centers where they're losing their water resources, where the land is drying up because the water is being, in a way, extracted at rapid rates that it can actually replenish. And I think that with that connection, we're bringing health into the center because our health is also suffering as Indigenous peoples, where, for instance, where we can no longer grow our traditional foods. So we have to rely on processed foods. And obviously, as a result, right, our health is declining. So what I'm seeing now and what makes me hopeful is that we're seeing how these climate change forums and discussions are being more intersectional and integrating more things aside from the data, right? Because we know our temperatures are increasing, we know that our greenhouses gas emissions are increasing, but behind those data points sits, as you mentioned, the stories and the voices of those who are often forgotten and are facing the highest impacts of climate change.
Yeah, and it feels like There are growing amounts of frameworks as people are understanding the depths of the impact of these, for AI, a growing industry, for fossil fuels, a very dominant, monopolizing industry. And we see, like in Santa Marta, many countries now kind of moving past the fossil fuel lobbyists and saying, no, like, we need this, we need this. But in that, sometimes communities, they get lost in this separation between these international high level forums and negotiations and, cooperations and what's actually happening at community levels. So, given your experience, like how can communities build that resilience while navigating systemic barriers and rapid, often disorienting change? As somebody who is also getting an AI data center in their backyard, right?
That's tough, right? Because we often see how people who make those decisions are not necessarily taking any community perspectives or hearing any community voices. And oftentimes, even when talking to my elders who have attended, these UN forums for years, like even longer than both of us have been alive, one of the things that they say is that oftentimes these are the only platforms that many of them have to voice their concerns and to in a global stage. And I think that when we were talking earlier about accessibility, right, many of our communities do not have access to talking to people or policymakers who are actually making these decisions. And oftentimes you have to reconcile that sometimes these international forums can go so far, but it's important to continue sounding the alarm wherever we can, right? So that, because if we plant seeds, right, in those 3 generations, we might not necessarily need these forums anymore because people are finally listening to our communities. But I think is ensuring that we're intentional with attending these forums. And for instance, right, the United Nations is right now a permanent forum of Indigenous peoples is still ongoing today, and this week, and we're seeing how many Indigenous leaders are sounding the alarm for what is happening in their countries and in their communities when you talk about climate change, the intersections of climate displacement, health, and even AI centers that are the biggest, one of the biggest major topics this year as well. Ashley, I think you're muted.
Oh my goodness, that was such a good one as well. Okay, so we were talking about it's because my kids just came in and the dog started going off. We were talking about today being May the 4th and tomorrow being May 5th, which is in Canada, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Day of Awareness. And it's a really important day. We were making a social media post. We were looking to connect Indigenous people with the climate and climate solutions. And of course, the figure that always comes to my head about the impact of Indigenous people is how 5% of the world's lands is stewarded by Indigenous people, yet the 5% of those lands are home to over 80% of the world's biodiversity. I think that's such a pivotal point to continue to reiterate and bring up as we talk about Indigenous people being a central pillar in the climate solution. And you, for your first book, use the banana leaves. For your second book, use the papaya tree metaphor, which resonated very deeply with a lot of us. How do you see these cultural resilience and rootedness informing climate solutions today?
Thank you so much. And I should have told you that you were muted earlier, but I was enjoying watching you be so happy. But I think that oftentimes, right, and it's going back to the empathy, right? Oftentimes when we look at the banana tree, and I kind of discussed it, how it's not a native plant, but it has become a displaced relative that in our communities we have started to love and even incorporate in our foods. Then we look at the papaya, and the papaya trees are a native fruit and plant to our lands. And interesting, when I was writing the book, I was reading on research on how it's a very polarizing fruit, right? People either love or hate it. And it's hard to find anybody who's like, oh, I love papaya sometimes, but not all the time. Like, it's a very polarizing fruit. And when I talk about climate displacement or many of the topics that we're talking about today, right, they're also very polarizing topics where as a society, we have been taught and conditioned to be pro or against it, but there's no nuances that we are incorporating in discussions or even our own thinking. And as a result of that, we can learn from plants that, despite being displaced or despite being native, there's harmonies that can be created, right? Because oftentimes the banana tree grows on the same lands now that the papaya trees grow. And while I'm not saying that all invasive species are can live in harmony with our environments, the banana tree has been loved in a way that is not outcompeting native plants in our regions. And what we can learn is that we can look at something such as climate refugees, immigrants, as the same way that we will love displaced plants. And it's going back to how plants can also be very polarizing, right? And how many of the topics that we have been discussing today can also be polarizing, where people are either for or against it, but not having those discussions to meet in the middle ground or even hear from both sides, right? Because you just are in either side and there's no
You're on your side of the fence and we don't talk to neighbors, right? Uh, there's actually a few questions in the chat. So I'm going to segue over to some of the questions that are trickling in. And I encourage everybody to continue to ask some more questions. So thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge through the books and here with us this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are. How do we as immigrants and or settlers take action without perpetuating these damage-centered narratives? Or even the romanticization and museumification that comes with talking about Indigenous, like current Indigenous communities?
Yeah, thank you. And I love that question because it reminds me of my grandmother, right? And her teachings. And one of the teachers that she taught me it was to carry myself as an unwelcome guest because she knew that my parents and I were displaced. Fortunately, we're the only ones displaced because of my mom meeting my dad, who was seeking refuge in the United States. So all of my family is back home. But she reminded me that anywhere I went, I was an unwelcome guest, right? So for instance, if I were to go to your home without an invitation, I'm an unwelcome guest. So how do I build those relationships, not just with the environment, whether it be your home, but also the people who are stewarding that home, right? In that case, it would be yourself, so that I can become a welcome guest. And oftentimes as settlers or immigrants, we have to navigate our societies and lands as an unwelcome guest. So building relationships with the indigenous peoples, because we often hear in mainstream environmentalism, right, to reconnect with nature, but we forget that we should also reconnect with indigenous peoples who have stewarded that nature or that landscape. And as a result, right, we can shift ourselves from being a welcome guest to being a welcome guest. And I think that that obviously takes time, right? Because you have to build those relationships. Like it doesn't take just having one coffee afternoon to build those relationships, right? It takes time. And I think that's something that we can do, like build relationships with the indigenous peoples, because oftentimes you can volunteer, you can do many things that they need support in, and we often feel like it's inaccessible. But if we check out the websites like you were mentioning, checking, finding out whose indigenous lands you're residing on, they can help you navigate those relationship buildings that are essential for us to go from being in a welcome guest, whether it be a settler or immigrant, to a welcome guest and be welcome into the lands we're not occupying.
Beautiful. And the silver lining of all that is the wonderful stories of the land that you get to inherit throughout that journey as well, right? You want to reconnect with the land, well, you get to learn deeper and deeper about it than you could ever have imagined before. There's another question here saying that they've noticed that there's a general lack of empathy in the world now. I think we can really all resonate with that. People on opposite sides of the political spectrum, regardless of how unreasonable we feel their positions might be, cannot see eye to eye. How do you think that we can build empathy while continuing to act together against the continuing effects of colonization through environmental harm?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it's applying around the world, especially in the United States. I think that oftentimes we have to understand that people are hurt, whether they're on each political spectrum. And in order for us to heal ourselves and our communities from that hurt, we have to listen to one another. And I think that sometimes it's hard because, media and other things indoctrinate certain ways of knowing, or there's blame put on a certain group because of the hurt that we're experiencing. So, for instance, oftentimes when we talk about the anti-immigrant narrative that is happening in this country, right, is because people are hurt. People are suffering from job loss. Like, we are having the highest rates of job loss in the United States that, recently. And as a result, right, people are blaming immigrants for that job loss or for that economic inequality that is existing. But I think it's educating ourselves so that we can understand where they're coming from, and also understand that some people are just not going to change, right? Because oftentimes we invest our energy in trying to help somebody unlearn or look at it from a different lens, but empathy will allow us to understand why is that hurt happening. But oftentimes, sometimes there's no solutions, right? And the solutions is to just invest in the future generations and teach them different ways that we haven't even been taught, or our society is teaching us, as adults.
Even in some instances, to just acknowledge, right? Acknowledge the hurt and the harm instead of continuing to placate and create harm. Yeah, this has been great. If anybody else has any questions, there's another one here asking if you can further explain how renewables are causing displacement for Indigenous peoples and what we've done to manage this unfortunate outcome, because it seems to offer more solutions to climate change than problems. Like, is that, what's your take on that?
So when I think about how renewable energy is displacing many people, is because the lands are being destroyed in a way that they are no longer livable. And oftentimes in many of our communities, we see the men being the ones who are migrating or being displaced so that they can find a better economic revenue or a better life for their communities and families back home. And I think that oftentimes when we talk about these renewable energy projects, they're not employing the local communities, they're bringing people from other parts of the world to work in these systems. And I think that's very important to ensure that if we want this system, in this case this renewable energy project, to support Indigenous communities, maybe provide them with the job opportunities and also the learning opportunities. But I say that we have to look at the environmental impacts they're having, because it is displacing many people just because of the environmental impacts these renewable energy projects are having. And I think it's something that we can address, right? If we start integrating the 2IC and then looking at how we can shift to renewable energies and make a solution that is not necessarily desecrating other people's lands. Because I mean, I think renewable energies is a solution, but it's right now it's a partial solution because it's leading to more impacts and destroying, and in this case displacing many Indigenous peoples, especially from the global south into the global north. And we're seeing how they're treated when they're trying to seek refuge or asylum in the global north.
Well, thank you. That was, obviously, you are so well spoken. And I say this as such a compliment because when I hear your name, I hear it in the same breath as people like Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I know that I've read many reviews that also put you in that same alignment. How does that feel? Like, do you feel like you're inheriting a mission or an objective here? Like, how do you feel about where you're moving in life and how that's kind of settling on your shoulders?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think that it's it's inspiring, but also in a way unreal, right? That when we talk about people who have moved the needle, like Dr. Robin Wall Kimmer, Dr. Gregory Cajete, Dr. Daniel Walcott, Dr. Kyle White, all of these Indigenous leaders and writers who have allowed for my generation and the future generations to be able to talk about these topics, they're still alive, right? And going back to the conversation I had with Dr. Barronda Montgomery, she also emphasized how many civil rights leaders who desegregated the United States, right? Like the Little Rock Nine we were talking about, are in a way how home is not the state of Arkansas, because my parents lived there too. How many of the Little Rock Nine, who are the nine Black children who were the first to desegregate the schools in the United States, are still alive? How, and some of them obviously have passed away, but how you can find them on Instagram, how you can find them on social media and have a conversation with them. And one of the discussions that I really had with her that I hadn't thought about is that how these histories are often portrayed in black and white pictures, as though color film didn't exist. And going to that connection, right? When I think about Dr. Robin Wall Kimmer, she's still alive. Like I would say she's still young, right? And it shows me how that 3 generations can create change is actually taking place. And I often say that it's thanks to people like her that have allowed us to be in this gray area, right? And I say gray area because, we have to move from acknowledgements into action. And it's our generation and the future generations are yet to come after me that will allow us to move from acknowledgements into actions. And we're the ones defining that. And I think having these conversations, having people like you who are, you know, willing to learn and unlearned, right? Because oftentimes we have to unlearn and listen to other perspectives that will allow us to move from that acknowledgement into action. And I often say how land acknowledgements, right, is also an acknowledgement, but how do we move to action? And I think it's being in that gray area and having people who are willing to learn, not just from Indigenous communities, from other communities, and also willing to teach us, right? Because everybody has their own story, so that we can move into action. And yeah, thank you for that. I think it's I think of how, and this was an elder metaphor that recently told to me, how we're a river, right? And how when you look at the top of the river, it's kind of slower. And as it goes down, it builds momentum. And the future generations are that momentum that will take us from, that docile waterways into the rapid movements and changes that we need in our future.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Deep, deep gratitude for you spending this evening with us, or afternoon, depending on where you are. I think the theme for this was acknowledgement into action right from the beginning to end. If this is going to be up on YouTube, so please feel free to share this with everybody that you would love to hear some of this wonderful knowledge. And again, a deep, deep gratitude for you, Dr. Hernandez, for sharing it with us. I get to pass it over to my lovely colleague, Ella, now. And again, I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. It's been such a joy to hear your wisdom and expertise. This has been such a good conversation. And I want to share with our participants just before we log off that if you're inspired by what you've been hearing today and you want to learn more how you can take bold climate action with climate reality, we invite you to join our global network of 4.5 million working to build a just and sustainable true net zero future. And this month in particular, we have an exciting opportunity for those who are in the US to join a fast-paced half-day training near you where you can learn, connect, and take action with people in your region. All of the event attendees will also get exclusive 1 month only access to an online training to complete your certification and join our Climate Reality Leadership Core. So we've put the link to that in the chat. And as always, you can visit climaterealityproject.org to learn more about our campaigns, programs, and initiatives. And if you're a climate reality leader or a US chapter member, we again encourage you to visit Reality Hub to explore our latest action alerts and opportunities for learning. And don't forget to stop by our book club group while you're there. If you don't yet have a Reality Hub account, you can again contact support at Climate Reality and we will assist you. And we've also dropped the link to join the next group discussions with our lovely friends at Climate Reality Canada in the chat, and keep an eye out for an announcement about our next book club webinar. So thank you again so much, Dr. Hernandez, for joining us today, and Ashley for moderating. Take care, everyone.